My name is Emily Carter, and I am 32 years old. The morning I signed my divorce papers, Philadelphia gleamed like a postcard. Clean spring light on glass towers, trees leafing out along JFK Boulevard, cabs slicking through puddles from last night's rain. Inside the attorney's office, it smelled faintly of lemon polish and old carpet, and my mother sat across from me with her handbag perched on her lap like a trophy. The conference table was too wide for comfort. I had to lean forward to reach the last page. My hand didn't shake, but something deeper did, like a loose window rattling in wind. When my pen lifted, a woman I had spent 5 years becoming, wife, builder, partner, lifted with it and vanished into the air between us. If you're watching right now, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. Tap that like button and subscribe to follow the entire journey of how manipulation, control, and betrayal tore apart everything I thought was secure, and how I fought to reclaim it. The receptionist congratulated us on finalizing matters, the way someone might congratulate you for finishing a marathon you never signed up to run. My mother thanked her in that tidy, precise voice she uses when she wants the world to applaud her composure. "You'll feel better soon," she told me in the elevator, checking her reflection in the gold door. I watched our faces stretch and narrow as we descended, hers placid, mine startled, like I'd just realized I'd been sleepwalking. How did I get here? How did Ethan and I, two people who once built grocery lists on napkins and dreams in the car, end up on opposite sides of a corridor of attorneys? The short answer is my family. The longer answer starts long before Ethan, before the architect's sketches and lake-light vows, back in a house where love and obedience were synonyms and loyalty meant surrendering the map of your life. I grew up in the suburb of Wynwood, in a brick colonial with a flag that never missed a holiday. My father, Daniel Carter, owned an insurance agency he treated like a legacy. My mother, Linda, curated our lives the way other people curate art. The right schools, the right friends, the right causes. My sister, Rebecca, arrived first and fit the frame immediately. Pageant smile, straight A resume, tennis whites that never seemed to stain. I was the second child with scuffed knees and opinions, the one who preferred sketchbooks to teas and could sit in silence with a book until the sun left the room. Our house had rules you couldn't point to, but you could feel. We hosted without making scenes. We disagreed by becoming quiet. Achievements counted more if they could be displayed. Sacrifices didn't count unless they were for the family. My mother had a phrase for choices that didn't align, separating yourself, as in, Emily, is that what you want, to separate yourself? I learned early that independence sounded, to her, like betrayal said in a nicer dress. I met Ethan at a neighborhood rebuild weekend after a storm tore shingles and branches from half the block. He was an associate at a small architecture firm, the kind who brought measuring tape and a spare thermos, who asked more questions than he answered. He had a careful way with broken things that made it feel possible to be one of them. We spent the afternoon removing waterlogged drywall from a stranger's kitchen, passing soggy panels like planks on a narrow bridge. When he laughed, it was low and unguarded, like he didn't need to audition for the room. 6 months later, he was telling me about a row house he wanted to restore, the line of its roof, the way light would fall across the stairwell in winter. I could see it because he could. The first Sunday dinner at my parents' house told me everything I didn't want to know. My mother's questions to Ethan were decor. Where did you grow up? How long have you been with your firm? My father talked past him to Rebecca's fiancé about golf and new tax codes, and Rebecca scanned him head to toe with the polite curiosity you reserve for a guest who arrived in the wrong shoes. After dessert, my mother cornered me at the sink, hands in lemon-scented water. "He seems nice," she said, the pause doing all the work. "But nice isn't enough for you." It could have been a question. It wasn't. What started like mist became weather. There were the wedding magazines my mother slid across my coffee table that featured hotel ballrooms and corporate-friendly guest lists. There were the charity galas where my parents forgot to include Ethan's name on the place cards. There were the subtle corrections, my mother's fingers pinching the hem of my dress, my father's eyebrows at Ethan's scuffed boots. But the tone sharpened after we got engaged and chose a small ceremony by the lake over a spectacle under chandelier light. My father called me to his office and stood instead of sitting, a performance of disappointed strength. "You're making a mistake," he said. "He will hold you back." I remember thinking how odd it was that love could feel like forward motion to me and like an anchor to him. We married with our friends' laughter bouncing across water and the smell of pine in the air. My mother didn't speak to me for 3 months. Rebecca sent a single text, "Hope you're happy." The period at the end felt like a door closing. Ethan and I returned to our small apartment with hand-me-down plates and a plant that refused to live, believing that distance was enough to keep the Carter weather out. It wasn't. The phone became my family's instrument. Calls at odd hours about imagined crises. A deductible question my father could have solved in 60 seconds without me. A migraine that disappeared by morning. A donor breakfast my mother couldn't host alone. Every favor came wrapped in a compliment that was really a hook. "You're the only one we can rely on," my mother would say, and I would put on flats and drive across town because I wasn't ready to be the daughter who said no. When I stayed too long, Ethan reheated the dinner he'd made and said gently, "We have our life too, Em." I told myself that compromise was adult and boundaries were cruel. I told myself a lot of things. The first real fracture didn't shout, it hummed. My mother began inviting Ethan to coffee, just the two of us, a gesture that, on paper, looked like outreach. He went because he wanted to believe we could be a family without sides. He didn't tell me the content at first, how she measured our marriage in inconvenience, how she wondered aloud in those small, sincere tones if maybe I seemed lighter when I stayed overnight at my parents' place after late errands, how marriage should be a help, not a hindrance. When he finally admitted the shape of those conversations, he looked ashamed, like he'd failed a test he didn't know he was taking. "I thought it would fade if I ignored it," he said. "I thought giving it oxygen would make it grow." It had already grown. The ambush came at a family dinner I agreed to attend because missing it would have been a statement. My father raised his glass before the main course and said, "We're glad you're remembering where you belong." The room softened, as if it agreed. I asked, "What does that mean?" My mother set down her fork. "Ethan's been honest," she said, tone wrapped in velvet. "He says you're unhappy, that you're considering a little time here to get your feet under you." I looked at Ethan and watched the way his eyes dropped, guilty but also tired, the kind of tired that makes hope feel like a luxury. Later, in the car, he told me he had never said those words, not exactly. He had nodded when my mother worried about my stress, had answered, "She seems overwhelmed" when she called at midnight, had let silence stand in for self-defense because he didn't want to escalate. The weeks after were a study in erosion. We spoke in careful sentences that couldn't hold our fear. My mother's texts brightened with emojis and phrases like "healthier choices," as if divorce were a kale smoothie. My father sent me an email with a list of attorneys who were reasonable and discreet. Rebecca forwarded real estate links for apartments closer to us. Mathematically, there wasn't much left to solve. On the day the papers were ready, Ethan and I decided not to sit in the same room. There are endings that require bravery and endings that require mercy. We couldn't find either. He signed in the morning, I signed at 11. When I came out to the street, my mother slid on her sunglasses, light glinting off the lenses. "You'll thank us one day," she said. It was the kind of line a person practices. I stared past her at a bus stop ad for summer concerts and thought of all the small music we'd made, grocery runs and library finds and cracked mugs glued back together, and felt a hollow ringing in my chest where sound should be. I went home to an apartment that remembered us. 2 mugs still on their hooks, a dent in the couch cushion where we used to fold laundry and watch bad crime shows. I stood in the doorway for a long time, listening to traffic below and to a quieter noise inside me, a scratch of something that wasn't grief. Not yet rage either. more like a pilot light refusing to go out. I didn't know it then, standing among our ordinary things, but that little insistence, that ember the size of a freckle, would be the start of everything that came next. The first breath you take after the wave lets you up, the moment a map redraws itself because you decide to move. I have been told that childhood shapes you, but in my family, it didn't just shape you. It carved you into a role and expected you to fit it forever. Looking back, I can see how much of my life with Ethan was decided long before I ever knew his name. In the Carter house, you learned early which daughter you were. Rebecca was the one with the polished edges. Every ribbon from gymnastics hung neatly in her room, her debate team trophies lined up like little soldiers. She knew how to lean into my father's approval until it felt like gravity itself. I was different. I read novels in the corner at dinner parties, doodled floor plans on the backs of placemats, and asked too many questions during church sermons. That difference wasn't something my parents celebrated. It was something they managed. My mother had a way of framing it. Rebecca understands the bigger picture, she'd say, as though my view was stuck on a smaller, unimportant map. I was praised when I helped, corrected when I strayed, and quietly ignored when I did something they didn't value. Still, I grew up craving their approval like sunlight in a shaded yard. I learned to dress the way they liked, muted colors, understated jewelry. I learned to nod instead of argue. I learned that the only safe rebellion was the kind no one could see. By the time I graduated college, I had mastered the art of existing in my family without setting off alarms. I lived in the city, worked as a junior project coordinator for an interior design firm, and came home for Sunday dinners where I was expected to laugh at the same stories and admire the same victories. When I met Ethan, it was like discovering a hidden room in my own house, space I didn't know I was allowed to take up. He noticed details no one else did. How I rearranged cafe chairs before sitting, how I paused before answering questions like I was testing the air first. He told me I had a mind that built things, even if those things weren't made of brick and steel. At first, I thought I could keep him and my family in separate spheres, like oil and water in a glass. But spheres have a way of rolling toward each other, especially when your family believes that anyone who loves you is a potential acquisition. The first time Ethan met my parents, we'd been dating for 6 months. He wore a navy blazer that fit him well and brought a bottle of wine from a small vineyard he'd visited on a work trip. My father took the wine, read the label, and set it aside unopened. My mother asked where his family was from, and when he said they were from Scranton, she smiled faintly, as if she'd just been handed a sweater with a loose thread. The drive home was quiet until Ethan said, "They don't like me." I told him it wasn't dislike, just unfamiliarity. But inside, I knew better. In my family, unfamiliar was dangerous. They began testing him almost immediately. Invitations to dinners where the dress code was deliberately unclear. Conversations about politics or business designed to trip him into the wrong answer. Compliments that were actually measurements. And through it all, Ethan tried, God, he tried. He offered to help my father with a small office remodel, suggested ideas for community projects my mother chaired, attended Rebecca's engagement party even when he had a deadline. It wasn't enough. 2 months before our wedding, my father called me to his study. His desk was covered in paperwork, though I suspected he'd staged it for effect. "Emily," he said, "I need you to think about the long term. Marriage is about building something, partnerships, strategy. I'm not sure Ethan understands that." "I'm not marrying him for strategy," I replied. He leaned back, steepling his fingers. "Then you're not thinking clearly." I left that day with my hands shaking and my heart pounding, but I didn't tell Ethan the full extent of what was said. I didn't want him to feel like the fight was already lost. Our wedding was beautiful in ways my parents couldn't measure. It was by the lake where we'd had our first weekend getaway, with wildflowers in mason jars and music from a friend's guitar. But my mother's absence in the family photos told its own story. She stood in the second row during the ceremony, smiling just enough for the camera, already thinking about the next move. The moves came quickly. That first winter, my mother began calling me during work hours, insisting she needed my help with small errands. If I said I was busy, she'd sigh and say, "Rebecca would have made the time." My father started questioning whether Ethan's work as an architect was stable enough for the long haul. At family dinners, Rebecca would drop hints about people from my past, old boyfriends, colleagues, as if to remind me of other roads I could have taken. Ethan noticed. He asked me once, after a particularly tense evening, "Why do you let them get to you?" "Because they're my family," I said. "And I'm not?" he replied. That was the first time I didn't have an answer. The pressure was constant. If Ethan and I took a weekend trip, my mother would guilt me about missing a family function. If I spent a holiday with my parents, Ethan would grow quieter, as if he was bracing for a storm. I started lying in small ways, telling my mother I was working late when I was actually having dinner with Ethan, telling Ethan my parents weren't that bad when I knew they were worse. Then came the day of my father's birthday dinner. We were barely in our seats when he raised his glass. "We're glad you're finally coming to your senses," he said. I frowned. "What does that mean?" My mother's smile was as tight as the pearls around her neck. "Ethan's been honest with us. He says you're overwhelmed, that maybe some time back home would be good for you." The words felt like ice water down my spine. I turned to Ethan, but his eyes were fixed on the table. After that night, something shifted between us. Conversations became careful, touch became rare. My mother's calls grew warmer toward Ethan, colder toward me. I could feel the ground tilting, but I kept telling myself it was temporary, that love was enough to hold against the pressure. It wasn't. When Ethan finally packed his things, he didn't shout. He didn't even blame me. "I can't fight them and keep us together," he said, "and I can't watch you choose them over and over." The truth was, I hadn't realized I was choosing, not until the choice was already made for me. When the door closed behind him, the apartment felt bigger and smaller all at once. Bigger without his presence, smaller without the life we'd imagined in it. My mother called an hour later, asking if I wanted to come over for dinner. I said yes. And just like that, the space between who I was and who they wanted me to be began to disappear. If there's one thing my family excelled at, it was turning suspicion into certainty. By the time Ethan and I had been married a year, my parents no longer treated him like an outsider. They treated him like an enemy they were determined to defeat, and they were strategic about it. It began with whispers, always delivered through someone else. A cousin mentioning over brunch that my father worried Ethan might not be able to support me long term. A neighbor telling me my mother had heard Ethan was too controlling. None of it came directly, which meant none of it could be confronted. Then the whispers became small acts of exclusion. Family trips accidentally booked for weekends when Ethan had deadlines. Invitations that came addressed only to me. Events where there was somehow no chair for him at the table, and a staff member had to find one in the back. My mother would laugh it off. Oh, what a mix-up. But her eyes told me it was anything but accidental. I started keeping score without meaning to. Every time Ethan was left out, every time my father asked about my work but not his, every time Rebecca made a comment about men who marry up while sipping her wine. The tally climbed, and with it, the space between my husband and my family widened. Ethan noticed. Of course he noticed. He began skipping family dinners altogether, claiming late nights at the office. I didn't push him, partly because I understood, and partly because I didn't want him to see how often I came home feeling smaller than when I'd left. One evening, after a tense Sunday at my parents' house, Ethan and I sat in the living room with the TV on, but muted. He was staring at the dark window, his reflection faint in the glass. "They're trying to make you choose," he said finally. I tried to dismiss it. "It's not that simple." "It is," he said, turning to look at me. "They've decided I'm the wrong choice, so they're going to keep pushing until you prove them right." I told him he was overreacting, but deep down, I knew he wasn't. The campaign escalated that spring. My mother started visiting our apartment unannounced, always with a reason that sounded harmless. She'd bring over a casserole or a stack of magazines. then casually mention how tired I looked, how different I seemed. She'd ask if Ethan was helping enough around the house, as though marriage were a job review and she was the manager. One afternoon, she arrived while Ethan was still at work. She walked through our kitchen like she owned it, setting down a dish and pulling 2 wine glasses from the cabinet. "Your father and I have been talking," she said, pouring herself a glass. "We think you should take some time for yourself. Maybe come stay with us for a while. It would give you space to think." "Think about what?" I asked, though I already knew. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "About whether this marriage is giving you what you need." I laughed, not because it was funny, but because the alternative was screaming. "I don't need space from my husband. I need space from you." For a moment, I thought she might actually look surprised, but then she leaned back in her chair and said softly, "You're making a mistake, Emily, and we can't stand by and watch you throw your life away." That was when I realized they weren't going to stop. Not if I set boundaries. Not if I begged. Not if I tried to make them understand. They had decided my marriage was a problem, and problems in the Carter household got solved. Ethan began withdrawing even more after that. He stopped asking what my family had said or done, stopped sharing his own frustrations about them. His silence was its own kind of wall, and I didn't know how to climb it. When we did talk about my parents, it always ended the same way. "They're not going to change," he'd say. "And you're not going to try," I'd reply. "We were both right and both wrong. And both." The breaking point came one humid August evening. Rebecca invited us to a small family dinner, which turned out to be 20 people crowded into my parents' backyard under strings of white lights. Ethan had reluctantly agreed to come after I promised it would be low-key. Halfway through the meal, my father stood and tapped his glass for attention. "I want to take a moment to acknowledge something," he said. "It's been a difficult year for our family, but we're seeing positive changes. Emily has been spending more time with us, reconnecting. It's good to see her remembering where she belongs." There was polite laughter, murmurs of agreement. I felt my face heat. "What does that mean?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. My mother glanced at Ethan before answering. "He's just saying we're happy you're finding balance again." Rebecca smirked. "It's nice to have the old Emily back." I turned to Ethan, waiting for him to defend us, to say something, anything, but he just stared at his plate. When we got home, I asked him why he stayed silent. "What was I supposed to say?" he asked, not unkindly. "Anything I say just proves their point. If I defend us, I'm controlling. If I keep quiet, I'm indifferent. Either way, they win." It was hard to argue with that logic. It was harder to live with it. The final push came in September. My father called me into his office again, the way he had before the wedding. "Emily," he began, "I think you know your marriage isn't working." I bristled. "That's not your decision to make." He leaned forward. "It is if we're the ones picking up the pieces when it falls apart. You've been unhappy for a long time. You can keep pretending, or you can start over." I realized then that in their minds, the decision had already been made. All that was left was for me to sign the papers. I left his office with a dull ache in my chest, went home, and told Ethan what had happened. "I can't keep doing this," he said quietly. "I can't live in a marriage where the loudest voices are outside our walls." Neither of us said the word divorce that night. We didn't have to. By October, we'd met with attorneys. My family offered to help with the legal process, but their help came with conditions. Property divisions they thought were fair, timelines that fit their convenience, terms that made sure Ethan left with less than he deserved. I told myself it was about efficiency, but I knew better. It was about control. When I finally signed, it felt less like the end of a marriage and more like the conclusion of a long, carefully executed campaign. My family had won, at least that's what they thought. If there's a moment when the air shifts, when you go from thinking you're just having a bad year to realizing you're in a fight you didn't choose, it's rarely dramatic. For me, it came in the form of a Tuesday afternoon and a knock on my apartment door. It had been 3 weeks since the divorce was finalized. The apartment still carried pieces of Ethan, his coffee grinder on the counter, a folded sweater on the back of the couch. I hadn't touched them yet. Some part of me thought he might come back for them, even though we both knew he wouldn't. When I opened the door, my mother was standing there with a brown paper bag and a bright smile that felt rehearsed. "I thought you might like some of my chicken soup," she said, stepping inside before I could answer. I hadn't invited her over since the divorce, but she moved through the apartment like she owned the lease, setting the bag on the counter, glancing at the photos still on the walls. "It's time to make some changes," she said, peering into the living room. "This place still looks like his." I stood there, stunned, as she began collecting frames with pictures of Ethan and me. She stacked them neatly on the table, like they were clutter to be thrown out. "Mom, stop," I said, my voice sharper than I expected. She turned, expression carefully neutral. "I'm trying to help you, Emily. You can't move on if you're surrounded by the past." I wanted to scream that she was the past, that she had created the mess she now pretended to clean, but instead I said nothing, because I knew that to her, silence was a kind of surrender, and in the Carter household, surrender was the path of least resistance. The days began to take on a strange rhythm. My family didn't just visit, they monitored. My father would call under the guise of checking in, but his questions always circled back to whether I was back on track. My mother would invite me to lunch, then steer the conversation toward the future. Career moves that aligned with the family's image. Social events she thought I should attend now that I was available again. Rebecca was the worst. She treated my divorce like a cautionary tale she could use to polish her own marriage. At dinner one night, she leaned across the table and said, "You'll find someone more suited to you next time, someone who understands what you need." I asked her what she thought I needed. She smiled in that way she had, all teeth and no warmth. "Someone who doesn't pull you away from us." It wasn't even subtle anymore. I began to realize that the divorce hadn't given me freedom. It had given my family permission. Without Ethan in the picture, there was no buffer, no excuse to limit my visits, no reason not to attend every event they planned. My calendar filled with dinners, charity functions, weekend trips for the family. At first, I told myself it was temporary, that I could play along until things settled. But the truth was, the more I agreed, the more they expected. One night, after a long fundraiser downtown, my father drove me home. We rode in silence for most of the trip, the city lights flickering across the windshield. Just before we reached my building, he said, "I'm glad you've come to your senses, Emily. You belong with us." I stared at him, wondering if he even heard himself. Belonging, to my father, wasn't about love. It was about ownership. My friends noticed the change. A college friend, Marissa, invited me out for drinks one Friday. I declined, saying I had a family dinner. "You always have a family dinner," she said. "Since when do you see them this much?" "Since the divorce," I admitted. She hesitated. "And you're okay with that?" I shrugged, not trusting myself to answer. The truth was, I wasn't okay, but I didn't know how to say that without also admitting I'd let it happen. The control tightened in ways that seemed small, but added up. My mother began suggesting I move closer to them, just to make it easier for all of us. My father offered to help with my finances, despite the fact that I didn't need help. Rebecca started forwarding profiles from friends of friends she thought I should meet. It was like being pulled into a riptide. The more I tried to swim parallel to it, the more it dragged me under. The lowest point came in early December. My parents hosted a holiday party, inviting what felt like half the city. I had barely stepped through the door before my mother whisked me over to meet a man named Andrew, a banker in his 40s, divorced, with the kind of handshake my father respected. As we stood there, making awkward small talk, I realized my mother had been watching us from across the room, her expression calculating. It hit me then. The divorce wasn't the end of their campaign, it was just the middle. The end would only come when I was remade into someone who fit the family mold again, married to the right man, living the right life, moving through the right circles. And for the first time, I wondered if they'd ever actually loved me, or just the version of me they could control. That night, back in my apartment, I sat on the couch staring at the stack of photos my mother had pulled from the shelves weeks earlier. I hadn't been able to throw them away, not because I still wanted Ethan back. By then, I knew too much damage had been done, but because they reminded me of the person I'd been when I chose him. That person had believed she could live her own life, even if it meant disappointing her family. Somewhere along the way, I'd lost her. I wish I could say that was the moment I decided to fight back, but it wasn't. It was just the moment I realized I couldn't keep going like this. The next steps would take time and courage I wasn't sure I had yet, but something in me was shifting. I started declining the occasional invitation, giving excuses that were half true. I began spending more time with Marissa again, meeting her for coffee before work, letting myself remember what it felt like to be around people who wanted nothing from me but my company. And slowly, I began to imagine a life that didn't revolve around the Carter family's approval. It was only an idea then, fragile and untested, but it was mine. And for the first time in months, that felt like enough to hold on to. The ultimatum came on a cold Sunday night in January, the kind of night when the streets gleam under street lamps and you can see your breath in the air like smoke. My mother had invited me for a small family dinner. I should have known better. In the Carter household, small was just code for important and you can't say no. When I walked into my parents' dining room, I knew something was different. The table was set with their best china, the one they only used for holiday meals or business guests they needed to impress. Rebecca and her husband were already seated, whispering in the corner. My father was at the head of the table, a glass of red wine in his hand, and my mother stood behind her chair, smiling in a way that made my stomach tighten. "Emily," my father said as I sat down, "it's time we had a real conversation about your future." I didn't touch the breadbasket in front of me. I didn't know my future was on tonight's menu. Rebecca smirked, and my mother gave her a look before turning to me. "We've been patient," she began. "We've given you time to process everything. But we think it's time you started thinking seriously about the next chapter of your life." "The next chapter?" I repeated. "Yes," my father said. "You've been drifting, living alone in that apartment, going to work, coming here when you feel like it. That's not a plan. That's just waiting for life to happen to you." My jaw tightened. "I'm fine. I don't need a plan that comes from this table." Rebecca leaned forward. "It's not about control, Emily. It's about stability. You can't live in limbo forever." I almost laughed at the word control. If there was a family crest above the Carter fireplace, it would be a crown stamped over that word in gold. My mother slid a manila folder across the table toward me. "We've been talking to someone we think you should meet. His name is Andrew. He's successful, established, and he understands our world. We've arranged for you to have dinner with him next week." I stared at the folder like it was a bomb. "You've arranged? I'm not going on a date you planned for me." "This isn't about dating," my father said sharply. "It's about aligning your life with the right kind of people." I pushed the folder back toward them. "No." My father's voice dropped, cold and precise. "Then you're choosing to separate yourself. And we can't keep extending ourselves for someone who doesn't want to be part of this family." It was the same phrase my mother had used when I was a teenager, when I skipped a debutante luncheon to go on a hiking trip with friends. Back then, I'd caved. This time, I felt the weight of it differently. "You've been extending yourselves," I said. "You forced my marriage apart because you didn't approve, and now you think you get to decide what comes next for me? Number, I'm done." My mother's voice was quiet, but it carried across the table. "If you walk away from this, Emily, don't expect us to be here for you when you need us." I stood up. "When have you ever been here for me when I needed you?" The room went still. Rebecca looked down at her plate. My father set his wine glass down with exaggerated care. "That's your choice then," he said. "Yes," I replied. "It is. I didn't go back to my parents' house for weeks after that. My phone lit up with calls and messages, most of which I ignored. The few I did answer were from my mother, alternating between guilt, "We just want what's best for you," and icy dismissal. "It's your loss, Emily." Rebecca sent a single text, "You're making things harder than they need to be." I didn't answer. At first, the silence felt like punishment, but then it began to feel like space. I spent that time quietly reclaiming parts of my life I'd let my family own. I rearranged my apartment, bought art I liked instead of what I thought they'd approve of. I started saying yes to invitations from friends I'd been avoiding because my mother disapproved of them. But the hardest part wasn't filling my calendar, it was resisting the pull. Because the thing about my family's control was that it didn't always feel like control. Sometimes it felt like safety, like home. And when you've been trained your whole life to equate their approval with belonging, walking away feels a lot like being lost. In mid-February, my father showed up at my office. He hadn't called ahead. I found him sitting in the lobby, flipping through a brochure for the company's design services, like he was a potential client. "We need to talk," he said when I approached. I led him into a small conference room, closed the door, and waited. "I don't want us to be at odds," he began. "But I can't stand by while you make decisions that lead nowhere. You're 32, Emily. You should be thinking about the future, about building something that lasts." "I was building something," I said, "and you tore it down." His jaw tightened. "That marriage wasn't going to last. We did you a favor." "No," I said. "You did yourselves a favor. You couldn't stand that I chose someone you couldn't control." For a moment, I thought he might get angry. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, almost amused. "You think independence is doing whatever you want without considering the bigger picture. That's not independence. That's selfishness." I stood up. "If that's what you think, then maybe we have nothing to talk about." That night, I called Marissa. I told her everything. The dinner, the ultimatum, my father showing up at my job. She listened quietly, then said, "Emily, this isn't just about control anymore. This is about power. They're trying to keep you exactly where they want you, and the only way to stop them is to take that power back." Her words stayed with me. I didn't know what taking the power back would look like yet, but I knew it had to start with something bigger than just saying no. For years, I'd believed my family's version of love was the only kind I could have. But sitting in my apartment that night, I started to imagine a life where love wasn't conditional, where I could build something without asking for permission. The idea scared me. It also thrilled me. The trouble with ultimatums is that they don't just hang in the air. They follow you, like the faint smell of smoke after a fire. You try to tell yourself it's gone, that the danger has passed, but it clings to your clothes, your hair, the corners of your mind. After that January dinner, I thought I could hold my ground. I avoided my parents, limited my calls with my mother, ignored Rebecca's barbed messages. But the Carters never stop pressing once they've decided on an outcome. By March, the pressure was back, only now it was subtler, dressed up as concern. My mother called me at work to say she'd run into Ethan at the market. "He looks thinner," she said, letting the pause hang. "It must be hard on him losing you. I hope you're not blaming yourself too much." It was the first time she'd mentioned him since the divorce, and the way she said it, like I had destroyed something I'd promised to protect, landed heavier than I wanted to admit. A week later, my father sent me a friendly reminder email that my car lease was coming up for renewal. He offered to help me find something practical. The underlying message was clear. I was drifting toward instability, and they were ready to step in to fix it. Rebecca kept her approach direct. If you'd just meet Andrew once, this would all calm down. It was exhausting, and I was tired in a way that went past sleep. That spring, work slowed down. The design firm had lost a major client, and while my position wasn't in immediate danger, I could feel the shift. The hours weren't as steady, the projects not as plentiful. That empty space in my schedule was dangerous. It gave my family room to move. My mother took advantage immediately. She invited me to help with a charity auction she was chairing. "Just until things pick up for you again," she said, as if I were in a holding pattern waiting for her to give me purpose. I should have said no. Instead, I told myself it was temporary, just a few hours a week. But soon, I was spending whole afternoons at her side, calling donors, reviewing menus, visiting venues, and with every errand, she wove in her message. See how much you can accomplish when you're not being held back, or isn't it nice to be around people who understand you? I knew what she was doing, but after weeks of distance, the attention felt comfortable, familiar. One afternoon in late April, we stopped for coffee after meeting with a florist. She stirred cream into her cup, watching the swirl like she was measuring her next move. You know, she said casually, Andrew is still interested in meeting you. I didn't look up from my tea. Mom, hear me out, she said quickly. You don't have to think of it as a date. Just two people having dinner. You might like him, and even if you don't, it wouldn't hurt to expand your circle. I wanted to tell her no again, to stand up and walk away, but instead, I heard myself say, I'll think about it. It was the smallest concession, and it was enough. 2 weeks later, I was sitting across from Andrew in a quiet corner of a restaurant my parents frequented. He was polite, charming in a practiced way, asking questions like he was checking boxes. Where did I see myself in 5 years? Did I want children? How did I spend my weekends? I answered because it was easier than starting a fight with my family about why I didn't go. When the check came, Andrew smiled warmly. I'll let your mother know we had a good time. The words hit me harder than I expected. He wasn't here for me. He was here because my family had summoned him and I had shown up like an obedient daughter. The next day, my father called. Andrew likes you, he said without preamble. I think you two should see where this goes. I told him I wasn't interested. He sighed, disappointed but unsurprised. Emily, you're making this harder than it needs to be. You've already seen what happens when you try to go your own way. Don't repeat the same mistakes. I hung up with my hands shaking. It wasn't just pressure anymore. It was rewriting the past to make me doubt my own choices. By early summer, the weight of it all started to show. I was skipping dinners with friends because I didn't want to explain why I looked so drained. My work performance slipped. My boss asked if everything was okay. I told him I was just tired. The truth was, my life no longer felt like mine. It was like my family had drawn a circle around me, and every time I tried to step outside it, they pulled me back with a reminder of what I'd lose if I left. One night in June, I went to my parents for what I thought was a casual dinner. Halfway through the meal, my father slid a document across the table. It's a power of attorney form, he explained. Just in case something happens, we can handle your affairs for you. It's practical. I stared at the paper. You want legal control over my life. He gave a short laugh. It's not control, Emily. It's protection. I don't need protecting. Yes, you do, my mother said softly. Everyone does. And you can't always see that in the moment. Rebecca reached for the bread basket, like this was just another course in the meal. It's really not a big deal. We all look out for each other. I pushed the document back across the table. I'm not signing this. My father's jaw tightened. Think about what you're saying no to. I already have, I said, standing up. I'm saying no to this, to all of it. I drove home that night with the windows down, the summer air warm on my face. For the first time in months, I felt something that wasn't exhaustion. I felt clear. They had taken my marriage. They had taken my peace. They had tried to take my choices. But this piece of paper was where I drew the line. I didn't know yet how I was going to get out from under them completely. But I knew one thing. The next move would be mine. The morning after I refused to sign that paper, I woke to a phone vibrating relentlessly on my nightstand. 5 missed calls from my mother, 3 from my father, 2 from Rebecca. No voicemails, just an urgent silence daring me to pick up. I didn't. Instead, I made coffee and sat by the window, watching the early summer light spread across the street. For months, my days had started with someone else's agenda, calls about urgent errands, meetings I hadn't asked for, questions disguised as advice. That morning, the only thing on my calendar was breathing. But by noon, the peace fractured. A knock at the door. When I opened it, my father stood there, perfectly pressed shirt, expression unreadable. He didn't wait for an invitation, just stepped inside like it was still his right. "We need to clear this up," he said, taking a seat at my kitchen table. I stayed standing. "There's nothing to clear up. I'm not giving you legal control over my life." He folded his hands. "You're overreacting. That form was a safety measure." "For you, maybe," I said. "Not for me." His jaw tightened. "You've made it clear you don't trust us." I leaned against the counter, crossing my arms. "You earned that." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he stood, smoothing his shirt like he was wiping off the conversation. "If you want to make things harder on yourself, that's your choice. But don't come to us when it all falls apart." He walked out without another word. For the next week, the silence was loud. No calls from my mother, no texts from Rebecca, no invitations, no pressure. It should have felt like freedom, and in some ways, it did. But the quiet also carried a warning. They weren't retreating. They were regrouping. Marissa noticed first. We met for coffee, and she tilted her head. "You're jumpy," she said. "I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop," I admitted. "It already did," she said. "Now you decide whether you're going to keep standing there or start moving." Her words stuck with me. I realized I'd been treating every interaction with my family like a reaction, waiting for them to move so I could respond. I hadn't made my own move in a long time. That night, I went through my apartment room by room. Anything that felt like it belonged to them, gifts with strings attached, framed family photos that made me feel more trapped than loved, went into boxes. Some I donated, some I put in storage, some I just threw away. It wasn't about erasing my family. It was about reclaiming my space. When I finished, the apartment felt different, lighter, like I could breathe all the way to the bottom of my lungs. But the Carters never stayed away for long. The first crack in the silence came from Rebecca. She showed up at my office during lunch, holding 2 paper cups of coffee. "I'm not here to fight," she said, setting one on my desk. "I just don't want us to end up like this forever." I raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" She sat down, smoothing her skirt. "Not speaking, pretending we're strangers. We're sisters, Emily. Being sisters hasn't stopped you from siding with Mom and Dad every time they've pushed me." She looked down at her coffee. "It's easier to stay on their good side." "That's not easier," I said. "That's quieter. For now." Rebecca didn't argue. She just stood and left the coffee on my desk. I didn't drink it. A few days later, my mother called. I almost let it go to voicemail, but curiosity won. "Emily," she said, her tone light. "We're having a small dinner Friday. Just family. No surprises, I promise." I didn't believe her, but I went anyway. The house looked exactly the same. Polished silver, framed photos, the smell of roast chicken wafting from the kitchen. My father nodded when I walked in, but said nothing. Rebecca was already at the table, scrolling through her phone. Dinner was civil. No lectures, no suggestions, no Andrew. Just polite conversation about the weather and my father's latest golf game. It was almost unsettling. When dessert was served, my mother reached across the table and put her hand over mine. "I know we've been strong-willed," she said, "but everything we've done has been to protect you." I met her gaze. "You can stop protecting me now." She smiled faintly, but her eyes didn't match. "We'll see." That "we'll see" followed me home. I lay awake that night, thinking about how easily they could slip back in if I let them. I'd been living on defense for so long that I'd forgotten what offense looked like. The next morning, I made a decision. If they were going to keep playing their game, I needed to change the rules. I started small, blocking their ability to drop by unannounced by installing a new security system. I told my building's front desk to call me before letting anyone up. I stopped answering calls in the moment, letting everything go to voicemail so I could decide if it was worth responding. But the bigger shift was internal. I stopped thinking of myself as someone waiting to escape their control. I started thinking of myself as someone already free, who just needed to keep building a life that reflected that. By the end of July, the changes were noticeable. My apartment was my own. My calendar was filled with things I wanted to do, dinners with friends, weekend trips, classes I'd been putting off. Work picked up again, and I found myself actually enjoying projects without the constant static of family interference. Of course, they noticed. My father called one evening. "You've been hard to reach," he said. "I've been busy," I replied. "With what?" "Living my life." There was a pause. "Don't forget where you came from, Emily." "I haven't," I said, "but I'm deciding where I'm going." For the first time, I hung up without waiting for his approval or bracing for his disapproval. It was a small victory, but it was mine. The pushback started quietly, the way a storm sometimes begins, with air so still you can hear your own heartbeat. It was mid-August when the first sign came. I'd been invited to a design industry networking event, and the firm had even asked me to give a short talk about one of our recent projects. It was the kind of opportunity I'd been working toward for years. The morning of the event, my phone lit up with a text from my mother. "We're having a family brunch at the club today. Everyone will be there. Don't disappoint us." No question mark. No hint that she even considered my own plans. I stared at the message for a long time before replying, "I can't. Work commitment." Her response came within seconds. "Some things are more important than work." I didn't answer. I went to the event, gave my talk, and left with 2 new clients for the firm. It should have been a win. But by the time I got home, 3 missed calls from Rebecca and 1 from my father were sitting on my phone like tiny threats. The next week, the rumors started. Marissa texted me first. "Hey, someone at the club said your firm is struggling. That true?" It wasn't. But I didn't need a detective to figure out where it came from. My family had their ways, carefully placed comments, phrased just vaguely enough to spread doubt without evidence. I'd seen them do it to business rivals, to friends who'd fallen out of favor. Now I was on the list. By the end of the month, I was hearing from mutual acquaintances that I was having trouble and seemed a little lost since the divorce. I recognized the tactic immediately. Isolation through reputation. If they couldn't control me directly, they'd try to shrink my world until I came back willingly. But something had changed in me. Before, that kind of pressure would have sent me scrambling to fix it, explaining, defending, overcompensating. Now, I chose silence. I let the rumors float unanswered. If people were willing to believe them without asking me, I didn't need them in my life. The shift confused my family. Without the reaction they were used to, they had to find other angles. Rebecca tried the guilt route. She called one evening, her voice soft. "Mom's been crying about you. She feels like she's losing you." "She's not losing me," I said. "She's losing control of me." Rebecca didn't argue. She just sighed. "You've changed." "I've grown," I corrected. In September, the first real sign of outside support came from an unexpected place. One of my father's old business associates, Mr. Harris. He'd always been polite to me, but distant, as though our conversations were just social obligations. We ran into each other at a charity art auction, and to my surprise, he asked me to join his table for dinner. "I hear you're doing good work," he said over dessert. "Not easy to make a name for yourself with certain people making it harder." The glance he gave me said he didn't need me to confirm who those certain people were. He told me he'd been on the receiving end of my family's brand of pressure years ago. "Best thing I ever did was stop caring whether they approved," he said. They respect strength more than submission, even if they won't admit it. It was the first time I'd heard someone outside my circle name the truth out loud. It made me realize I wasn't as alone as they wanted me to think. Still, their reach was wide. In October, I found out a potential client had backed out of a contract after hearing concerns about my reliability. When I pressed for details, they said they'd heard it from someone close to you. I didn't have proof, but I didn't need it. I knew. I went home that night and stared at the city lights from my balcony. For years, I'd thought of my family as unshakable, too entrenched in their world to be challenged, but the cracks were showing. They wouldn't be working this hard to undermine me if they weren't feeling the loss of their grip. That thought gave me something I hadn't had in a long time: leverage. I began documenting everything, every rumor I could trace, every message that hinted at pressure, every coincidence where a work opportunity disappeared after a family interaction. I didn't know yet what I'd do with it, but having it made me feel less cornered. Meanwhile, I doubled down on my independence. I took on a side project, designing a boutique hotel lobby, something outside my firm's usual scope. It was risky, but it was mine, start to finish. I didn't tell my family about it. By November, the project was picked up by a local design magazine. My face and name were in print for something they had no hand in. That, more than anything, seemed to ignite a new wave of retaliation. The week the magazine came out, my mother showed up at my office. She didn't ask to meet in private, she just walked in, heels clicking against the tile, and stood in front of my desk. "You're embarrassing us," she said. I blinked. "By doing my job well? By making it clear you don't need us," she snapped. "It's disrespectful." I leaned back in my chair. "Then consider this my formal notice. I don't need you." For a moment, I thought she might actually slap me. But instead, she straightened, smoothed her blouse, and said, "We'll see how long that lasts." That night, I expected to feel shaken. Instead, I felt steady. Her threat wasn't new. It was the same one they'd been making my whole life, dressed in different words, and every time before, I'd believed it. This time, I didn't. If they wanted a war, I was ready to stop playing defense. I used to believe the greatest betrayals came in one decisive blow, sudden, obvious, impossible to miss. What happened next taught me otherwise. The most effective destruction, I learned, is patient. It creeps in slowly, disguised as concern, and by the time you notice, it has already woven itself into every part of your life. In the days following my official divorce, my parents changed tactics. If before their approach had been aggressive, sharp words, constant pressure, now it was almost delicate. Like a surgeon carefully cutting away the last remaining connection between me and the life I had built with my ex-husband. The phone calls began first, daily, sometimes twice a day. At first, I mistook them for genuine concern. But soon, I recognized the pattern. Every conversation carried small criticisms, suggestions disguised as advice, and subtle reminders that I needed to rebuild myself. Their version of rebuilding didn't include anything or anyone tied to my marriage. They started showing up at my apartment unannounced. I could be in the middle of a work call when I'd hear the knock. I'd open the door to see my mother holding grocery bags, my father standing behind her with that same evaluating expression I'd seen my entire life. "We brought you some things," my mother would say, brushing past me into the kitchen before I could answer. It should have felt kind, but it didn't. The food they brought was food I never ate. The clothes my mother just happened to find on sale were in colors I never wore. None of it was about me. It was about reshaping me into the person they thought I should be. The pressure was quiet, but constant. My father began forwarding me job postings in cities far from where my ex lived. My mother, accidentally, left open house listings on my coffee table when she visited, all in neighborhoods they approved of. At first, I laughed it off, but as the weeks passed, the persistence wore me down. I started noticing how carefully they avoided certain topics: my career progress, the friends I'd kept after the divorce, any mention of my ex-husband's name. It was as if those parts of my life didn't exist anymore, and in their silence, I could feel them trying to erase them completely. One evening, I stopped by their house for dinner. My father was in an unusually good mood, pouring wine before we even sat down. My mother served her roast chicken, the same meal she made for every important family discussion. Halfway through the meal, my father set down his fork. "There's an opportunity you should consider," he said. I kept my eyes on my plate. An opportunity for what? A position opened at a firm I know well. Stable, good salary, benefits, it's a fresh start. There it was, the fresh start speech again. Only this time it wasn't a suggestion, it was a directive. I took a slow sip of wine, buying myself time. "I'm not looking for a new job," I said finally. "You should be," he replied, his voice calm but sharp. "Everything you built before is compromised. You need distance from it." My mother's eyes flicked between us, her fork frozen midair. She didn't interrupt. She never did. I left that night with an ache in my chest. The kind that comes from realizing the people who claim to love you are actively dismantling the pieces of your life that still bring you strength. The real breaking point came a week later. I was meeting with a client at a cafe downtown when my phone buzzed. It was my brother. We rarely spoke, so I answered immediately. "Did you know Mom and Dad called Mark?" he asked. I froze. "What are you talking about?" "They met with him, said they wanted to clear the air." My stomach dropped. The last thing I needed was my parents dragging my ex into their version of events. "What did they tell him?" My brother hesitated. "I think they told him you were better off without him, that he held you back, and that you agree." The client sitting across from me was still talking, but her words faded into a dull hum. My pulse was loud in my ears. "Why would they do that?" I whispered. "I don't know," my brother said quietly. "But it sounds like they're trying to make sure you never speak to him again." That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in the dark, replaying every interaction of the past month, seeing the pattern clearly now. They weren't just moving me away from my marriage. They were controlling the narrative so completely that even if I wanted to reconnect with my ex, the bridge would already be burned. By morning, my shock had hardened into resolve. This wasn't care, it wasn't love, it was control, wrapped neatly in the language of protection. And I knew something with absolute clarity. If I didn't set boundaries now, they would keep tightening the noose until there was nothing left of the life I recognized as mine. I picked up my phone and typed a short message to the family group chat. "I appreciate your concern, but my personal life is mine to handle. I need space. Please don't contact my friends, my colleagues, or Mark. If that boundary is crossed again, I'll have to cut contact completely." I stared at the message before hitting send. My finger hovered over the screen, my heart pounding, then I pressed it. Within minutes, the replies came in. My mother's was first. "We're just trying to help you. Don't be so dramatic." My father's followed. "You're making a mistake, but you'll see eventually." For once, I didn't respond. That evening, I went for a walk through the city, the cool air clearing my head. The skyline glowed in the fading light, and I thought about how many times I'd been here before, making choices that went against my family's expectations. Every single time, it had been hard. Every single time, they had tried to pull me back. And every single time, moving forward had been worth it. This would be no different. I didn't plan the day it all came together. I had penciled it in my calendar as a panel at the design center, 30 minutes on adaptive reuse and community-first projects, followed by a small reception. To anyone else, it looked like another professional blip in a city full of them. To me, it was an access point, the first time I'd stand on a stage and speak only in my own voice, with no Carter subtext vibrating underneath every syllable. By then, fall had slipped into early winter. Philadelphia had that clean, bright chill that makes everything sharper at the edges, and the river ran like steel beneath the bridges. I had started running again, always before sunrise, tracing the same loop past row houses whose windows held small golden squares of kitchen light. Work felt steady in a way it hadn't in months. The boutique hotel lobby I'd led had opened to a full reservation book. The magazine feature had translated into 2 solid contracts, and I'd finally said out loud the sentence that had hovered for years. I wanted my own studio. I began it quietly, an LC filing, a name I wrote on a sticky note and left above my desk for a week to see if it felt like mine. Lighthouse design. It was earnest, maybe, but I kept coming back to the image. Not a ship hauling people away, not a harbor locking them in, just a beam that says, "Here you are. Here is the contour of the shore. Make your own choices about how to approach." I pushed the first retainer check across a conference table to an accountant who spoke in calm, careful phrases about quarterly filings and cash flow. I rented a small space in a brick building off Callow Hill with rattling radiators and a view of a mural that looked different in rain than it did in sun. I bought a secondhand drafting table and a new coffee maker and a plant I promised myself I would learn to keep alive. I texted Marissa a photo of the keys in my palm, rooms behind them blurred into light. In the months since the message I dropped in the family group chat, boundaries had become a practice, not a declaration. I let my phone live on Do Not Disturb and check it on purpose, not by reflex. I answered emails first thing, then again mid-afternoon, and refused the impulse to keep refreshing. I told clients the hours I was available and discovered most people were fine with clarity when you offered it before apology. I met with a local nonprofit about pro bono work to redesign a women's shelter entryway, lighting, signage, small touches to make arrival feel like dignity instead of exposure. I drew late into the night and slept like a person who had nothing to hide. My family's strategy adapted too. Without an audience for their immediate demands, the gestures grew symbolic. A holiday card with a photo of all of them in front of a fir tree. No note, just names. A forwarded email about a prestigious gala seat I should consider buying. My father's message in mid-December, family dinner, the 23rd. Mandatory. I didn't answer. On the 24th, a second message arrived. Your absence was noticed. On the 25th, I drove to New Jersey to spend the day with Marissa's parents, who fed me honey-glazed ham and sent me home with leftovers wrapped in foil swans. It turned out you could build a family out of people who didn't insist on authoring you. The morning of the panel, I woke before my alarm and lay there, listening to radiators hiss, watching the washed-out gray of pre-dawn empty into something more like day. I thought about the women I had watched on stages when I was younger, the ones who made choice sound effortless, as if courage arrived like mail. It didn't, I knew now. Courage was a habit, assembled one small refusal at a time, until suddenly the thing you were practicing had become the way you lived. I made coffee. I ironed the single silk shirt I owned that always made me stand straighter. I packed a slim folder with notes I probably wouldn't use, and a pen that felt heavy enough to anchor me if the room turned. I tucked a business card into the cover for Lighthouse and slid another into my wallet, because names feel firmer when you can touch them. The venue was already humming when I arrived. Event staff checked badges, the audience collected in 3s and 4s, the low static of winter coats unzipping and programs rustling. The moderator met us backstage and ran through the format. 5 minutes of opening remarks from each panelist, then Q&A. I could do 5 minutes in my sleep. I had done 5 minutes in conference rooms and living rooms, and once, unfortunately, in an elevator when a client got stuck between floors. I took my seat. The moderator introduced us one by one. When she said my name, the room felt like it tilted a degree and then righted itself. I spoke the way I had practiced in my kitchen, pacing the length of the rug, about scale and intimacy, about how reusing a building can be an act of respect, about light as a tool of invitation rather than surveillance. I said that good design should make people feel more like themselves and less like they're being evaluated. I did not say the word family, but I could feel it there, like a watermark beneath the ink. After, the moderator opened the floor. A woman in the second row asked how you know when to trust your taste over the client's. A student asked what to do when your boss steals credit. A man in a navy sweater asked about budgets, because of course he did. I answered each as simply as I could. Then a hand went up near the back. The voice when it came was familiar enough to make my shoulders tense before my brain caught up. Do you think independence can become selfishness? The person asked. At what point does your own path mean ignoring your obligations? The room went quiet, not because the question was unfair, but because it had a tone I knew. I shaded my eyes against the lights. It wasn't my father, I knew that already. But it could have been someone sent, or someone who thought like him, which sometimes is the same thing. I could have dodged. You can always dodge. Instead, I told the truth. I think independence without accountability isn't independence at all, I said. It's isolation with better branding. But I also think obligation gets weaponized, especially against women. If the demand is for you to shrink to fit a role you didn't write, declining that demand isn't selfish. It's sane. A few people nodded. The moderator moved us along. I took a breath I didn't realize I'd been saving. When it ended, I stepped off stage into a tangle of handshakes and program edges and small talk. A young designer introduced herself and said she'd never heard someone talk about light that way. The nonprofit director hugged me and pressed a folded sheet into my hand. Dates for a site walk, a note that said, "Thank you for seeing what we see." A man I recognized from the hotel project told me he had a friend who needed a lobby reimagined, maybe two. It felt like standing in a river with fish schooling at your legs, not guaranteed, but alive. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I let it buzz. When the cluster thinned, I pulled it out. 2 messages. The first was from my father. Saw a clip. "Don't forget who helped you get here." I didn't laugh, but I did release something that had been clenched between my ribs since I was a child. Because this was the revision, the alternate history in a single line. The claim that proximity equals authorship, that proximity equals ownership. The second message was from the shelter director, a link to a small grant program we could apply for together. I clicked it. I scanned the requirements. It was doable. It would mean sitting at a folding table, scribbling budget lines at midnight. But I had done harder work for lesser causes. I wrote back, yes. On the sidewalk, the air knifed in around my coat sleeves. People poured out into the winter evening, red scarves and soft hats, and the clean clack of boots on concrete. As I stood there, my phone buzzed again. A different name this time, one that made my hands go warmer in my gloves. It was Ethan. We hadn't spoken since the papers. I had written a handful of drafts over the months. Apologies, explanations, a message that said nothing I say changes the fact that it happened, but I want you to know I see it now, and deleted them all because wanting to be understood isn't the same as being ready to be accountable. His text was one line. I heard your panel was good. I'm glad. There was no subtext in it, no hook, just an acknowledgement that the other existed and was doing something they were meant to do. I typed, deleted, typed again. Thank you. I'm sorry for everything I didn't protect. I hovered, because sending a truth is a kind of release you don't get back. Then I sent it. There was no immediate reply, and that was fine. The message wasn't a door, it was a stone set down. On my way home, I walked an extra block to pass the shelter. It was just a brick rectangle on a block that had more chain link than trees. But a woman in a quilted coat was holding the door for another woman with a toddler on her hip, and for a second, the place looked like a hinge. If we did the work right, we could make the entry read welcome instead of checkpoint. We could make the hallway say you matter without saying anything at all. Back at the studio, I flipped on the lamps and left the overheads dark. The plant at the window was somehow still alive, leaves leaning toward a light no longer visible. I spread the grant application out on the table and started making notes in the margin, cost of fixtures, volunteer labor estimates, materials we could get donated. I had always loved this part most, the math that turns hope into a plan. At some point, my mother called. The phone lit the corner of my desk, face down. I let it go to voicemail and kept writing. Later, I listened. Her message was short. "You were on the local news," she said. "Call me." The old reflex tugged. Fix it, soften it, go back. It passed. I wrote myself a sentence on a sticky note and stuck it to my laptop. Respond when ready, not when summoned. The next morning, I did call. Not because she asked, but because I wanted to try a conversation under the new rules. She launched first. That panel was a choice, she said. The way you spoke about obligations, people will think you meant us. I did, I said quietly. At least a little. Silence. Then, you make us sound like villains. I don't need you to be villains, I said. I need you to stop trying to be authors. Another silence. We are your family, she said at last, softening the word as if a gentler vowel could change its weight. And I am a person, I answered. Those can coexist, but only if you accept that mine isn't a role in your story. It's my life. We didn't solve it in a single call. Real things don't loosen that easily. But when we hung up, no one had threatened absence as punishment, and no one had offered presence as a prize. It was clumsy and truer than anything we'd said in years. In the weeks that followed, the practice kept being the point. I drafted contracts that made expectations explicit and timelines realistic. I set aside 10% of billable hours for pro bono work and treated that line like rent, non-negotiable, always due. I opened a separate account for taxes and made the transfer the day an invoice cleared. When the hotel client sent a bottle of champagne, I brought it to the studio and shared it with the electrician and the junior designer who had rerouted an impossible conduit run and the custodial staff who let me in early on Saturdays without asking why. I said yes to a mentorship circle for women in design and told them the thing I had needed most to hear at 22. You are allowed to be ambitious and kind at the same time. You are allowed to value your own work even when it makes other people uncomfortable. You don't owe your life to the version that keeps everyone else unchanged. On a late afternoon in January, the grant for the shelter came through. The email subject line said simply, award notice. I read it twice to make sure the words would stay. The budget number was small by corporate standards, large enough to make the hallway warmer in winter and safer at night. I forwarded it to the director and wrote, "Let's start next week." When she called, she was crying and laughing at once. We scheduled a community meeting for the following Thursday, folding chairs in a circle, butcher paper taped to cinder block walls. Women arrived one by one, coats shedding snow, voices low, tired, solid. I wrote my questions in big block letters and then shut up, which is the hardest thing and the only thing sometimes. They told me where it felt dangerous, where it felt humiliating, where small changes would mean they could walk in with their heads up and not scan for exits first. I made notes. I asked if I could take photos of corners, not faces. I drew a little rectangle for the entry and labeled it dignity. Later that night, alone at the studio, I caught my reflection in the window, the kind of accidental mirror that startles you because you're not trying. I looked like a person in the process of becoming, which felt less like a rival and more like permission to keep going. I thought of the girl who had sat quiet at debutante luncheons and then drawn secret floor plans on napkins, not because she knew she'd use them someday, but because something in her refused to stop imagining rooms that fit who she was. A text came in then. From my father. Saw the grant thing. Useful. Some people apologize by degrees they barely understand. I stared at the word useful and realized that, for him, it was as close to good as he could stand. I wrote back, "It matters." He typed, then stopped. No reply came. It didn't have to. Before I locked up, I pulled out the folder with the Lighthouse business cards and set one by the door for morning, a small ritual to remind myself that this wasn't an accident. You build what you practice. I had practiced a smaller life for so long that I'd forgotten the alternative was learnable. On the walk home, the city exhaled steam from manholes, and the sky cleared to a hard, bright cold. I passed the lake where we'd set our vows years ago and didn't flinch. The memory had softened, less like a cut, more like a scar that proves the skin kept closing. By the time I climbed my stairs, I knew how I wanted to end this chapter, not with a door slamming or a victory pose, but with an invitation. Because all along, I had needed someone to say, your story counts, even if the people who raised you won't read it. Your choice counts, even when it redraws the map. Your voice counts, especially when it trembles and you speak anyway. If this story resonated with you, please like and subscribe to support this channel and share it with someone who might need to hear it. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and the moment you realized your life gets to belong to you. I'm listening.